morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Good morning, good morning. Glad to have you with me again this morning. We're continuing with our reading of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits. The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, Secretary of the U.S. Navy. And he tells us that the only viable threat to this country was the papacy, the counter-reformation led by the Jesuit order, the purpose of which is to restore the temporal and spiritual power of the Pope over the whole globe. And nowhere is freedom more threatened than in the seat of freedom in the world, the United States of America. And that is what R.W. Thompson spent most of his life proving through these two books that we've read. First, The Papacy and the Civil Power, and now this one, The Footprints of the Jesuits. He's speaking about the Jesuits, an organization of papal militia whose history has been written about voluminously, but everyone seems to ignore. Mainstream media, the alternative media, they're all content to talk about they and them and the powers that be, but never willing to mention who they are. Governed by a spirit of fear. You know, what really seems to be impressed upon my mind is the fact that since the American people are so unwilling to mention who it is that is bringing the world to its knees and threatening our constitutional republic, that it is somehow based in fear. Fear of naming the opponent. Fear of naming the cause of the downfall of this country. And as I was talking to a good friend of mine and a supporter of Inquisition Update the other day, it's apparent to me that the fear involved in not being willing to mention the organization specifically that is bringing down this country and the world is an attempt to alleviate any responsibility to take action against them. I think the American people are so enamored and infatuated with the way things are that they realize that if they take an open and active opposition, that all will be lost. And they're willing to live with things the way they are so that they don't get worse. Well, I don't believe God gave His people a spirit of fear. I believe that knowledge is power, and that power and knowledge comes from both, from the Scriptures and from history. And with that knowledge and the power comes the responsibility to act. And I think as responsible Christians, we should be able to, and willing and ready to face this Goliath among the nations and launch our first stone, aiming for the center of his forehead, and that once our stone has struck its target, to immediately be ready to pick up his sword and lop off his head and carry it high so that the whole world can see it. Just like David, fearless in the face of Goliath. That's the only way to win the war. To name the enemy, face him squarely, take the stone, the smooth stone called Christ, and launch in swiftly toward the center of the target, And then when the giant falls, to immediately lop off his head and hoist it high and show the world that it can be done. That's what R.W. Thompson insists is necessary for the American people if we're to save our republic. Do you have faith in Christ? Do you have faith in David, in the example that David placed in the Scriptures for us? Or are we going to be like the rest of the world? Continue to hide from the identity of the one who's causing so much turmoil in the world. Well, I've made my decision. I made my decision a long time ago. I'm going to the stream bed to pick up my smooth stone, and I'm prepared to launch it, and I am launching it and have been launching it here on Inquisition Update ever since the first broadcast. And I'll continue to launch that smooth stone against that Goliath called the Jesuit order until Christ takes me home. Will you join the battle? Will you join the battle, or will you remain hiding in the weeds? R.W. Thompson is telling us that the Jesuits have launched a counter-reformation, that the nations of the world saw that the papacy was the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist, that he had tyrannized the world. He had united church and state and placed the people under his dictation. Darkness pervaded all of society, and they wished to liberate themselves with the new knowledge of Christ, that they needed no pope, they needed no priest, they needed no sacrifice, and they certainly didn't need a king over their country who took every order from the Pope and not the people. And they overthrew not only the papacy, but their kings, and they replaced them with civil government, government of, by, and for the people, called popular government. They replaced tyranny with popular government, freedom. The people then became the legislator of their own laws. They decided what laws would be enforced by the government. No more tyranny. No more pope. No more priests. Only Christ and faith and self-government. Well, the Jesuits have launched a counter-reformation, and that is to bring the papacy back to world supremacy. To bring back the union of church and state, where the church can dictate to the state how it must govern the people, and to tyrannize the people, and to make the Pope once again, as it were, a god on the earth. Are we going to remain silent about it? R.W. Thompson's not silent about it. If you're following along in this book, Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, we concluded near the end of the page of page 18. But for continuity, I'm going to back up to the top of the paragraph. He says the differences between popular and monarchical governments are well known and appear at every point of comparison which has arisen during the course of events since the Reformation of the 16th century. The author recognizes that popular governments were first known in the world after the Protestant Reformation. Before that was nothing but tyranny, papal tyranny. And he says the former have achieved their completest triumphs where Protestantism prevails. In other words, popular governments, governments of, by, and for the people, have achieved their completest triumphs where Protestantism prevails, and in its presence, the latter that is, papal despotism, monarchical forms of government, have been compelled either entirely to surrender their pretensions or to abate their demands for absolutism. Pretty clear, right? The Protestant Reformation and the liberty that was achieved by the Protestant Reformation caused the monarchies to either replace their monarchical forms of government with constitutional republics or to at least tone down their monarchical malarkey. It revolutionized the world. The Protestant Reformation revolutionized the world. And the Pope saw it as rebellion. Rebellion against his divine right authority to rule the world. Now he says, until the Reformation became an accomplished fact, monarchism was maintained by uniting church and state and employing their joint authority to coerce obedience from the multitude. Okay? The first thing that should come to your mind anytime the words church and state united is used is papal monarchy, because that is the condition under which the papacy ruled the nations, by a union of church and state. He said until the Protestant Reformation became an accomplished fact, monarchism was maintained by uniting church and state and employing their joint authority to coerce, in other words, to force obedience from the multitude. The dominion thus acquired condemned self-government by the people as both heresy and treason. That's right. In the papacy's view, any form of government except monarchical government, and specifically papal monarchies, is heresy and treason against the papacy. The papacy is opposed to any government of, by, and for the people, not just the American form of popular government. He says the dominion thus acquired condemns self-government by the people as both heresy and treason, punishable at the pleasure of those who held the reins of authority in their hands. It took many years of conflict to change this condition of affairs. And when the people of the United States were, in the course of events, placed in a condition to choose between this coercive system and that which was the natural outgrowth of Protestantism, and to construct a government for themselves, their wisdom was sufficient to assure them that any plan of government they adopted would result in failure unless they distinguished between their politics and their religion by separating the church from the state, and by so framing their civil institutions as to preserve to themselves alone the entire sovereignty over them both. Okay? They knew that whatever government they chose, in order for it to succeed, there must be a separation between church and state. In other words, a union of church and state was a front door for the Pope to get in. They knew that if they had any hope whatsoever, they had to separate church and state. Make it virtually impossible for the papal system to raise its head in this country. And I'm repeating myself, but it has to sink in. Any attempt to unite church and state in this country simply means they've allowed the Pope to take over the government. Now, or that is in their immediate plans. The founders of this country knew it, the people of this country knew it, and we ought to know it today. But we've been conditioned to believe that this is a Christian country. And we've got to get back to God, and we've got to unite all the Protestants and the Catholics together to achieve it. And I want my listeners to know, as glowingly wonderful as that sounds, I want my listeners to know what their motive is, and that is to once again unite church and state. Oppose wickedness, oppose the sin of the sinful in this country, but not by a union of church and state. That is a fatal mistake for this constitutional republic. It's part of the Jesuit-led counter-reformation. To acquiesce to some romantic-sounding union of church and state, some Christian-sounding appeal for a union of church and state, is to sign the death certificate for this republic and religious liberty. And not just religious liberty, but liberty of speech, liberty of the press, liberty of conscience, liberty to keep and bear arms, every form of liberty that we love and cherish in this country, liberties that even are cherished by Roman Catholics. The papacy is betraying not only the so-called, the once called Protestants in this country, but the papacy is betraying its own people. The American Roman Catholics who love the liberties of this country. And that's what needs to be understood. Again, it says, if either of these essential prerequisites has been omitted, all exertions to better and improve their condition would have resulted in failure, as all readers of history know. Instead of failure, however, they created a government which has survived the vicissitudes of more than 100 years and is now supplying protection to more than 60 millions of people and has reached a most commanding position among the leading nations. If indeed its influence over the happiness and prosperity of mankind does not surpass that of any of them. That's right, in just 100 years, this government that separated church and state became a light on the hill. The glowing example for all the other nations in the world. When so many people over the world saw it as an attempt at failure, an experiment that was doomed to fail in less than 100 years, it became an example for all the nations to follow. And Italy was one of them. Right there in the shadow of the walls of the Vatican, Italy too proclaimed for itself freedom and independence, kicked the papacy out of their politics, separated church and state, and put a king elected by the people on the throne and adopted laws of, by, and for the people. And the Pope was livid. And worse than that, the American Roman Catholics rose up in support of the Pope and said that the legitimately instituted government of Italy was null and void and was a violation of the Pope's sovereign right, the divine right to rule Italy, and they donated their time and money and their blood to defend the Pope's right to rule Italy. And R.W. Thompson simply asking the question, if that's what American Roman Catholics think of constitutional government, liberty in Italy, what do they think about our government? R.W. Thompson is systematically exposing the subtlety of Roman Catholicism in this country. He said, instead of failure, however, they created a government which has survived the vicissitudes of more than 100 years and is now supplying protection to more than 60 million of people and has reached a most commanding position among the leading nations, if indeed its influence over the happiness and prosperity of mankind does not surpass that of any of them. Of this we may be assured, that the measure of its success has been such as to incite among other peoples the desire to imitate its example, and that the conflicts of opinions which now agitate the world give reasonable promise that the popular right of self-government may, in less than another century of time, be universally recognized. Okay, R.W. Thompson saying the success of this constitutional republic was so glowing that in another 100 years of time, the rest of the world would follow its example. Reminding you that this form of government was a direct result of the Protestant Reformation. Few people, even who are listening to me this morning, realize what role the Protestant Reformation had in creating this constitutional republic. That's why in many conversations I refer to it not only as a constitutional republic, which it is, but I call it a Protestant constitutional republic. Because that's what it is. That's what R.W. Thompson says it is. Or was. Now we have a choice. Are we going to defend Protestantism and our republic? Or are we going to allow one or the other or both be destroyed by the counter-reformation of the Jesuit order? That's the question now being decided right before our very eyes in this country. This is a test. This is a test. And most people on my side of the fence don't even know what the contest is about. It's about Catholicism versus Protestantism. The papacy is about to elevate itself to global supremacy if it hasn't already done so. And I'm chastised by some people who are avid listeners to First Amendment Radio and especially to Inquisition Update that it's a done deal. They've already conquered this country. We're just awakening to it. Be that as it may, I contend for the faith once delivered to the saints. I contend for biblical Protestantism, and I contend for the constitutional government that came out of the Protestant Reformation, and I take issue directly, continually, perpetually, forever against the Jesuit order and the counter-reformation to destroy it. That's the course that R.W. Thompson led the way. And that's what we all should be doing. It says, to this end, the American people are obliged to contribute by warding off every blow aimed at their institutions by either domestic or alien adversaries. Okay, domestic or alien adversaries. This author is acknowledging that we have both alien and domestic adversaries to our government. He's speaking specifically about the Roman Catholic Church and the Jesuit order and the papacy. They are both alien and domestic. He said, to this end, the American people are obliged to contribute by warding off every blow aimed at their institutions by either domestic or alien adversaries, especially when these blows are aimed, as some of them are, at the fundamental principles of their government. The papacy is trying to destroy our government. The Jesuits are trying to destroy our government. They're trying to unify church and state and to make America Catholic. Restore the temporal and spiritual power of the Pope, both in America and around the world. We'll talk about it more after the break.
I pledge allegiance to the King of Kings, and to his kingdom come, on earth as it is in heaven, one holy nation, and our Heavenly Father, grace, mercy, justice for all.
In this day of economic uncertainty and soaring unemployment, safe investments are often hard to find, but investing in the precious metals is the safest investment of all because gold and silver is real money. Government-printed currency is not. Call Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company at 1-800-375-4188. Melody has been helping people secure their financial future for over 10 years. While others in the business claim honesty, Melody will deliver. Give her a call, 1-800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Okay, welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. We'll continue with our book, The Footprints of the Jesuits. That's right, the Jesuits, right in the title of this book. R.W. Thompson was not afraid to name the enemy of constitutional liberty in this country. He named them, put a face and a name on them, the Jesuits. And he's absolutely correct. He said the American Republic was attacked by the Jesuits, and that it was an attempt to undo the Protestant Reformation and to undo all forms of government that resulted from the Protestant Reformation. Okay, it's called the Jesuit-led Counter-Reformation. And they attack our government. And for those who are regular listeners to Inquisition Update, they've attacked Protestantism. And we'll continue now with the reading. It says, the influence of our example, with the influence of the example of the United States of America, is what he's telling us. He says, the influence of our example finds a striking illustration in the revolution in Italy in 1870. Which abolished the temporal power or the kingship of the Pope, separated the state from the church, and established a constitutional form of government in place of the absolute monarchism which had prevailed almost uninterruptedly for many centuries. Okay, this author is recognizing that because of the government of the United States, our form of government, and the example that it set for the world, caused a revolution in Italy to achieve a like form of government. They revolted against the papacy. They established their own government and their own laws, and in a sense had a partial Protestant Reformation in Italy. Now, while they remained Roman Catholics and they were content to leave the Pope to be their spiritual authority in Italy, they wanted him to have nothing to do with their civil affairs. They ripped the kingly crown off of his head. They may have left his bishop's mitre, but they ripped off his kingly crown and retired him from that office. He was no longer King of Kings in Italy, right there in the shadow of the walls of the Vatican. They had a partial Reformation in 1870, which abolished the temporal power or the kingship of the Pope, separated the state from the church, and established a constitutional form of government in place of the absolute monarchism which had prevailed almost uninterruptedly for centuries. The fires of this revolution had been burning for a long time, kindled originally by oppressions. Yes, that's what happens during monarchical forms of government, oppressions. Okay? It had been burning for a long time, kindled originally by oppressions which had been so magnified that the people could endure them no longer. Their culminating point was the passage of the Conciliar Decree. It was called the Conciliar Decree, also called the Dogmatic Constitution, whereby it was declared that the Pope was infallible and could not err in matters of pertaining to faith and morals, that is, within such spheres of governmental, social, and individual duties and obligations as the Pope alone, for the time being, should decide to be included in his spiritual and pontifical jurisdiction. In other words, the Pope governed over every thought of the people. That's what you call tyranny and oppression. He said this act was considered the consummation of the Jesuit plan, at which the Italian people had been so incensed but a short time before that Pope Pius IX had been compelled to expel the members of that odious society, the Jesuits, from Rome. Look, Italy knew what the Jesuits were all about. The Roman Catholics of Italy knew what the Jesuits were all about. And that was to elevate the papacy over all the kings of the earth. But Italy chose to rebel. But they knew that it was the Jesuits who were responsible for declaring the Pope infallible and thus making him a god on earth against which no one dare rebel. The attempt to call the papacy infallible was a Jesuit attempt to consolidate all the power of the Roman Catholic Church in the Pope and to ascribe to him the very powers of God, that is, infallibility. And once declared and believed by the Roman Catholic people, it was assumed that no government on the planet would oppose him, because to oppose him would be to oppose God. And anyone who did, after the declaration of infallibility of the Pope, anyone who did rebel against him would then be regarded by the whole world as a heretic and a schismatic. Okay, this was an attempt to unite the whole world against any opposition or rebellion against the papacy. A papacy which the Jesuits created by calling the Pope infallible. Okay, but Pope Pius IX, out of the widespread knowledge and hatred of the Jesuits by the Italian people, at one point it says here Pope Pius the Ninth expelled the Jesuits from Rome, obviously for optic appearances only. Now it says the consequence was that the fires which popular indignation had kindled grew hotter, and it became impossible to extinguish them except by assuring complete success to the revolution. Okay, they threw all their efforts toward the revolution. And it says, therefore, the ink with which this decree of papal infallibility was written was scarcely dry before the Italian people, with extraordinary unanimity, determined to reject it, not merely because it was the introduction of a new principle of faith hitherto unrecognized in the Roman Catholic Church, but because they could easily see that it would place them and their children after them under Jesuit dominion and dictation. Okay, unlike the American people who seemed to know nothing about the Jesuit order, the Italian people knew a lot about the Jesuit order. They knew the decree of papal infallibility was to render to the Jesuits supreme power in the church, and that they would be subjected to papal dominion and dictation through the papacy for the rest of their lives and their children's lives, and they simply were not going to submit. Now, he says they realized that its acceptance would involve them in the obligation to submit to the absolute temporal power, the temporal rule of the Pope, in whose selection they had no voice, and to those whom he should think proper to put over them, whether fit or unfit, and thus put an end to all popular demands for the right of political self-government. They knew that if they didn't stand up, the Pope would rule supreme, and he would put in power a king, a monarch over Italy that they would have no say about, that the people would have absolutely no say about. They wanted self-government. They wanted to pick their own government. They wanted to pick their own king and to hold him under restraint so that they could enjoy the same liberties that we enjoy here in the United States of America as a result of the Protestant Reformation. Now, he says it involved no question of Roman Catholic religious faith, as the Roman Catholic faith had been handed down to them by their fathers, nothing whatsoever which involved their duty to God otherwise than as presumptuous men to answer their own selfish ends were striving to convert the Pope into a god upon the earth and themselves into his plenipotentiaries. So that they knew what they were up against. This was an attempt to make the Pope, as it were, a god on the earth and to subject all the Italian people to his supreme, ultimate, and unquestioned authority. Now it says, influenced solely by this conviction and stimulated by the success of the people of the United States had won, they merely abolished the temporal power of the Pope and created a constitutional form of civil government which places satisfactory limitations upon the authority of their king and establishes representative political institutions which provide that their voice shall be heard in the enactment of public laws. Okay, the Italian people did what this country did at its founding, that was to reject the authority of the papacy, separate church and state, make the state the servant of the people and not the servant of the Pope. They were trying to follow the example that the United States set for them. And it says, in this they have taken a long stride in the direction of government of the people, for the people, and by the people. They have cast off political absolutism, which the Jesuits commend to us as Catholicity. Okay, whenever you hear the word Catholicity, it means the Jesuit form of Roman Catholicism, a union of church and state, and the Pope is infallible and a God upon the earth. That's Catholicity. That's the New World Order. The New World Order is simply the Old World Order restored. Okay, the Old World Order, the United States, after the Protestant Reformation, threw off as did many of the nations of Europe. And even Italy, Roman Catholic Italy, attempted to follow the example of the Protestants to throw off the yoke of the Pope. But the Jesuits wanted to impose, again, Catholicity, total control by the papacy. And it says they have cast off political absolutism, which the Jesuits commend to us as Catholicity, and have assumed the station and dignity of an independent people. They have converted a priest-ridden oligarchy into a nation. Listen to that again. They, the Italian people, have converted a priest-ridden oligarchy into a nation. On this account, and this alone, they have made themselves the special objects of Jesuit malevolence, for the simple reason that the monarchical society of Jesuits has never, since its beginning, relented in its vindictive opposition to every form of civil government which recognizes the people as the source of political power. By the most fundamental principles of its organization, it is forbidden to sympathize with the sentiment of personal independence, or to allow its members to acquire the dignity of manhood necessary for participation in the affairs of government. In the face of the fact that the Italian people have not changed their religious convictions, they have maintained for hundreds of years with steadfast fidelity, that is, Roman Catholicism, and in the face also of the success of Protestantism as universally recognized, the Jesuits employ the extorted decree of papal infallibility as the basis for an argument to prove that the Pope is divinely endowed with such spiritual sovereignty over the nations and peoples as entitles him to prescribe at his own personal will and pleasure such laws and regulations concerning both faith and morals as are necessary for the government of society and the conduct of individuals throughout the world. All right, now let me boil it down to real simple, short phrases. The Jesuits elevate the papacy to a position that only God holds. That's infallibility. And once they did that ridiculous elevation of the Pope to a God on the earth, then they use that as an argument to prove that the Pope has the divine right to rule the whole world. That's the logic of the Jesuits. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But the whole world heeds this and is so fearful to attack it that they dare not utter the word Jesuit in this country with just stark raving terror and fear of being persecuted for it. Being called a Roman Catholic bigot or whatever. As though God gave us a spirit of fear. The Pope was elevated to a godlike status by the Jesuits. And then the Jesuits turned right around and argued that the Pope had the right to rule the whole world because he's infallible. It's a childish hoax. Yet it is treated as deadly serious by the governments of the world. And there's nary an outcry against this ridiculous notion. He says, within the circle of this extraordinary and unlimited jurisdiction that the Pope now has, they make no distinction between spirituals and temporals. That's right. The Pope being, as it were, God on earth now, infallible, he's not only the spiritual head of the world, he's the temporal head of the world. He picks the kings of the earth. He rules over the kings of the earth. From that city, that great city, Vatican City, which rules over the kings of the earth. You see Bible prophecy being fulfilled here? says, within the circle of this extraordinary and unlimited jurisdiction, they make no distinction between spirituals and temporals, never failing to make the power over the former sufficiently comprehensive to embrace the latter, according as the Pope himself shall decide. In other words, the Pope can do anything he wants in the realm of spiritual and temporal. They truly have made him, as it were, a God on this earth. And the whole world has to decide, who are they going to serve? Are they going to serve Christ, or are they going to serve this usurper, the Pope? And he says, hence they infer that this papal jurisdiction is not subject to any other limitation than such as he shall establish, and that it may consequently be rightfully enlarged so as to exact submission from all and set aside all requirements in conflict with it. Okay, the Pope is given the power in and of himself to establish his own jurisdiction without limitation and to put down any and all resistance. Okay, this isn't Tom Fress talking, that little plowboy from Iowa. This is R.W. Thompson, the Secretary of the U.S. Navy. And he's telling us what the Vatican has become in the world, and that it is an imminent threat to the United States and our form of government and the Protestant Reformation. He says, and the result they reach as logically following this premise is that the refusal of obedience to the Pope within this comprehensive jurisdiction violates the law of God and is heresy. In other words, you disobey the Pope, you have offended God. To disobey the Pope is to disobey God. It's heresy, and it's punishable. Under Roman Catholic canon law, it's punishable by death and excommunication from the church and eternal damnation. He says, therefore, as the Jesuits believe that the separation of church and state by the Italian people is heresy, so they are required also to believe that all civil institutions which have grown out of that separation, like those of the United States, not only have the curse of God resting upon them, but that they are divinely chosen messengers. The Jesuits are the divinely chosen messengers of heaven to bring them within this enormous circle of papal dominion. So the job of the Jesuits is to bring every government into submission to the ultimate governmental authority in the world, the papacy. That's the New World Order. You won't hear about this on the Alex Jones Show, because he's a Jesuit shill, okay? You won't hear this on even many other programs on First Amendment Radio. They either don't know it or they're too afraid to talk about it. But R.W. Thompson is right. Eric John Phelps is right. Daryl Eberhard is right. All the authors that we read here on Inquisition Update are right. Justin Dewey Fulton in his book Washington in the Lap of Rome was absolutely right. It's the Jesuits. The Roman Catholic Church is the only threat, either foreign or domestic, that has the capability of overthrowing our Protestant constitutional republic. And it's already been done. As I'm admonished by many of those who are serious researchers into this subject, observing the conditions of the government of the United States and the conditions of the people have determined they've already done it. Goliath now owns the house. Now, what are we going to do about it? Well, we're not going to do anything about it if we still are fearful of naming who it is who has taken over the house. If we can't put a name and a face on this foe, the opposition of God Almighty, then we'll simply be slaves to him. Or we'll die resisting. But I don't intend to be silent about it. I'll tell you that. It says, in assigning these powers to the Pope alone, they entirely ignore everything associated with the original and primitive organization of the Christian Church, and especially the important fact that it was not until the beginning of the 6th century that the Bishop of Rome succeeded in acquiring the distinctive title of Pope. Did you know it took 6 centuries for the papacy to elevate himself just to the position of Pope in the world? That's right. Before then, he was just known as a bishop like every other bishop. It took 6 centuries of struggling to force the world to accept the Bishop of Rome to be the Bishop of Bishops and called the Pope. 6 centuries. You know, the papacy's no God on earth. He's a beggar. Okay, he's been clawing his way to power in the world for nearly 2,000 years. Now look, if he was truly the vicar of Christ on the earth, would it take 2,000 years to claw his way to the power of powers in the world? Common sense dictates that the papacy is nothing but what the Bible claims it to be. The Antichrist. He says before that time, they had exercised at Rome only such powers as metropolitan bishops elsewhere, each of them having been called Papa or Pope. When the Roman bishop acquired by usurpation the exclusive title of the Pope, the other metropolitan bishops were reduced to a condition of inferiority and subordination, and he then required only the temporal power to assure to him the power and jurisdiction the Jesuits now claim for him. That's right, after he became known as the Bishop of Bishops or the Pope or the Vicar of Christ, it was then that the papacy had to struggle to get the civil powers to uphold his claim. The papacy had to rely upon the governments of the world to uphold his claim as being the Pope. Like I said, he's a beggar. But now the world just accepts it. The Jesuits have conquered the common sense of the people of the world. Oh, we've run out of time. I'll finish tomorrow. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, The Restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left-behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.